And so as a social scientist, one of the things that I do and that social scientists do when they want to look at how to compare two economic systems and the impacts that they have on people's lives, because people were writing about the fact that capitalism was bad for our love lives way back in the middle of the 19th century. And so the question is how do we do an empirical test? Well, we look for a natural experiment. And it turns out that, Germany was one country in 1945, and then it got divided. And pretty much one side was capitalist, one side was communist. There were other, differences, but for the most part, they're the same. And they're divided for 40 years by this, 45 years by this ideology, and then they come back together. Let's look at the differences. And that's what's so fascinating about the research that we have, is that it really does show that, again, using largely self-reported data, but consistently studies that have been done both before and after 89 show that people show higher levels of satisfaction and contentment and joy in their personal lives in the East compared to the West.
And I thought that one of the most interesting parts of this is that you talk about how the end of the Cold War also had negative effects for the West in general, because the gains around women's rights, around employment, education, that were achieved by the socialist or communist governments pressured the United States into doing that. And we saw that a lot with the civil rights movements, right? So yes. It was like embarrassing the United States into being better on issues of racism. Can you talk about how that played out in gender?
So Mary Dodziak has this wonderful book called Cold War Civil Rights, which precisely talks about the Cold War context of the U.S. civil rights movement. And the book that I published in 2019, it's called Second World, Second Sex, and it does a sort of similar thing for the women's movement. So very specifically, until 1957, Western male leaders largely thought of women's emancipation and arguments for women's emancipation as a communist front, right? So that communist appeal to women by convincing them that they would be happier if they could work outside the home or whatever. And so there's a wonderful book by Elaine Tyler May called Homeward Bound, which really talks about the kind of traditional American family as a Cold War artifact, especially in the 50s. But then in 1957, with the launch of the first Sputnik satellite, the American government goes, how the hell did they do that? Right? I mean, it's just a metal ball around the Earth that's beeping, right? But it scared people a lot. And one of the immediate paranoias that the American government had was that the Soviets were using women, that they had double the number of scientists, double the number of scientific geniuses, because they were identifying girls and giving them scientific education at an early age. So in 1958, the United States government passes the National Defense Education Act. And that is a piece of legislation that specifically earmarks money for the education of girls in math and science and engineering. Title IX, the legislation that we have that allows, that gives federal dollars for girls and women's sports, is also a reaction to the fact that the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries kept beating the United States at the Olympic medal count because of women's sports. We didn't have enough female athletes to compete against these amazing Soviet women who kept just clearing the decks of the gold medals. So I can give you a lot of other examples. 1961, the first Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which was signed by Executive Order 10980, I believe, by John F. Kennedy. In the preamble of that executive order, Kennedy cites national security as a reason why we need to think about women's rights. So we were scared. There was a fear that if the Soviets mobilized their women into the labor force and they were able to use women's intelligence. Another great example, if you guys have been watching The Queen's Gambit, is Soviet women's chess. Yeah, in the international realm, the Soviet women were amazing at chess. They just couldn't be beaten. So there are all sorts of ways in which, to the extent that American men in particular, but I would say a sort of brand of conservative 50s, because obviously this wouldn't be true of people who are affiliated with the left, right? The CPUSA, all these people who were purged by Huok and McCarthy. Right. But the kind of conservative traditional Americans for a long time argued that women just were naturally not good at things like math or science, or they weren't naturally competitive enough to be athletes, or they were naturally not X or naturally not Y. And then when the Soviet Union actually did it, either you had to argue, and by the way, some of them did, that Soviet women weren't really women.
Oh, right.
There's something unique about what was going over there. Or you had to admit that maybe women could be really good mathematicians or chess players or athletes.
And it's kind of like the options there are that we were wrong, or they can be really good at that. It sucks for women and womanhood and our definitions, but it's worth it because of national security to overcome,
Exactly.
To embrace this unnatural
thing, which is women working outside the home and in male professions. Yeah.
Right. And can you talk about some of the sex studies in terms of satisfaction and, the studies that you cite which support the claim that sex is better in socialist countries for women?
Okay, so the studies that are specifically cited in the book are a series of studies that were done. The first in 1988, so prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, by a sexologist in East Germany called Kurt Stark and his colleagues. And then because of the results, they were replicated after 89. So the first thing I want to say is that there's always a problem with self-reported data. So obviously people are answering these questions. And one of the critiques of these studies is that the women who were living under communism didn't answer truthfully or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But after 89, they were free to answer as they wanted, and there were similar results. The study was done over and over again in a variety of different ways. So the actual numbers are fascinating. So the two proxy questions for sexual satisfaction. The first is, the last time when you had sex, were you happy? And, did you feel happy? And, so this is kind of a weird way of saying, was it good or not? So GDR women said that 82% of the time, the last sexual encounter that they had, they were happy. Compared to women in the West, so this would be the FRG, the West Germans, only 52% said they were happy.
Big discrepancy, yeah.
That's a huge discrepancy, okay? And then they get a little bit deeper into, again, these double entendres, so to speak. So the second way they ask the question is, did your last sexual encounter leave you feeling satisfied? That's how they ask the question. GDR women, 75% said yes. GDR men, 74% said yes. So about equal.
Sure.
But with West German men, it's 84% of men said, yeah, I was satisfied after my last sexual encounter, but only 46% of West German women. So that's less than half of West German women compared to 75% of East German women. So this sort of shows you that there's something going on. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is preferences for marriage. So let's say you're dating, you're on the market, whatever, and you are having, partners. What percentage of the people that you're dating or that you might date, and of course, this is all heterosexual data that bears, these studies focus specifically on opposite sex couples. So in the east of Germany, the communist part of Germany, 73% of women and 74% of men said that they were interested in getting married. Like if they found the right person, they would be cool with that, right? Whereas in the western part, the capitalist part of Germany, 71% of women said that they would be interested in getting married, but only 57% of men.
Wow.
So, you have these really interesting discrepancies, which means that there's something there that is making maybe not the actual experience, but the way you reflect on that experience, if we're talking about self-reported data, significantly different in the East, that is socialist, compared to the West, that is capitalist. And so what I tried to do in the book is to try to tease out what exactly was going on in that data.